Hello, welcome to a new episode of Another History of the World. Today we're going to be talking about some of the cultural history of Western Europe from late antiquity through to the early modern period. We're going to look at witches and witchcraft to challenge the idea of a moral trajectory of history and see what the treatment of witches as figures of depravity can tell us about the history of European society as a whole. So a bit of myth debunking. We often think of witchcraft as something backward, part of the medieval ages, but actually witches were not a priority during the medieval ages. So witchcraft challenges the general narrative of progress, and there were changing patterns of persecution across different time periods and regions. The Malleus Maleficarum, the most well-known treatise on witches at the time, was written by a Catholic clergyman, Heinrich Kramer, and first published in 1486, so it had ongoing influence over the next 2 centuries. The idea of witchcraft developed from this time onwards, becoming demonological or satanic or what we call diabolism, and not just what we think of as magic, and ideas became more elaborate and popular from the late 15th century. From this period, there was increasing interest in sexual orgies with the devil, moonlit flights to meetings called sabbats, which kind of parodies mass, and baby stealing, while iconography in paintings, prints, and woodcuts showed women and female lust. In the 16th and 17th centuries, much later than people generally believe, hundreds of thousands of people were investigated and around 50,000 people, mostly women, were executed. Witchcraft persecutions were at their height between the Protestant Reformation and the Catholic Counter-Reformation and the Enlightenment, and by the 18th century the era of witch craze was largely over. So where were these witches? Well, it really varied in intensity in different locations. There were hotspots in early modern Central and Northern Europe, as well as famously the English colony in Massachusetts. 3/4 of all executions occurred in German-speaking territories, but despite violence directed at other groups, the persecution of witches was not a prominent feature in early modern Spain or much of Italy. In the medieval context, witchcraft established what some historians call the machinery of persecution, creating the other, something which continues to this day. By this time, society had evolved to no longer tolerate dissent or difference, and there was a fear of contagion too, which is linked to the Black Death and began to define witches in new ways. Historians have generally explained witchcraft as a behavioural phenomenon, but I would argue that misogyny is a necessary but insufficient explanation for violence. We need to factor in other specifics of time and place and read into the silences of the historical record. Men could be accused of witchcraft too. Historians have examined the effect of centralisation of government and government failures. They've also examined the local and environmental factors like food shortages which could trigger persecutions, and they've also examined psychological factors like the stigma of mental illnesses or even the use of psychedelic drugs. Recent scholarship has focused on the need for the cooperation of whole communities during witch trials, as well as interest in accusations generated by not just people in charge of towns and villages, but also accusers and witnesses in trials where there were increasing levels of literacy. Prosecutions were often shaped by inquisitors who were particularly interested in the relationship between the witch and the devil, so that diabolical interpretations were introduced during legal proceedings, but local accusers themselves had little interest in figuring out the theoretical origins of witches' powers. But the wider context lies in who had power in medieval society, where the Catholic Church had both religious and political authority, which itself had many sects and people vying for power, not least of which included the Pope. At the Lateran Fourth Council in 1215, in response to the disaster after the Crusades, both religious and political authorities refocused the Fifth Crusade on eradicating heresy, and so many historians see Lateran Fourth as the starting point of the Inquisition and the new focus on heresy specifically. There were acceptable sects to the Catholic Church, and there were heretical sects who were a threat to the hegemony of the Church. Some heretical sects were concerned with teaching the right theology, while others were concerned about the clergy and hierarchy in the church. So the Catholic Church sought to eliminate them, using the office of the Inquisitor to find heresy through new orders like the Franciscans and the Dominicans. The papal bull of 1252 by Pope Innocent IV authorized them to use torture to extract confessions of heretics in inquisitorial trials. So witches emerge in this context, often living on the fringes of mainstream society, posing a political or social threat to the establishment, non-subscribers to Orthodox Church doctrine, and often, but not always, unmarried women, old widows, spinsters, young and promiscuous women, low social status, and sometimes the mentally ill. Witchcraft functioned as a disease that needed to be cauterized, and heretics, Jews, Muslims, and witches were said to be in league with the devil to subvert the Christian order, produce social chaos, and prevent the salvation of Orthodox believers. So dissenters had to be pursued and eliminated through ruthless persecution and execution. The goal was to eliminate heresy from the purview of the Church in order to save the souls of good Christians who might be led into temptation. And so medieval society evolved so that it could not tolerate dissent or difference, seeking to eliminate and demonize the other, often through violence.